Hi, today we're going to create form submissions in Wized and Webflow. And whatever you're going to build, almost every interactive component that is sending data somewhere in your web application will be at least a kind of a form. For example, your like button is a form submission. Your ChatGPT input is a form submission. Your form is, of course, a form submission. But even your search is a form submission. Everything is a form submission. And we're going to do those things as form submissions so that they are accessible. This was the issue with Wized version 1. It was not accessible because you had to do on-click. So you had to add a normal button, and on-click of that button, it submits the form. But then it doesn't have the native form behavior if you're going to do something like this. So in the new version of Wized, that is the current version, we have the form submission event. So I'm going to tell you today how you are using this new form submission event in Wized and how you can send that data to your backend. And also a very important thing, because you want to use a real form and use the form submission event in Wized, because if the user clicks enter, that also submits the form, right? Which is, like the accessible behavior of forms. So let's get right started and, let's just get started setting up this form. I have my Wized account already linked with my Webflow project, but I also made a video on how to do that. But it's super simple. So now, when we do a form submission in Webflow, we will have the form block and the form element. The form block doesn't interest us, but the form itself, the form element, interests us. We want to add a Wized attribute on the form element itself so that then Wized can recognize any submit event happening inside of the form. Because if you click a submit button, it is not a button click event. It is not looking for the click. If you click the submit button, it is submitting the form. And then when the form gets submitted, Wized is chiming in and saying, no, that gotta go to Zano, or that gotta go to wherever. So this is how we're going to do that. And the benefit of doing that, it is accessible. So when your user uses certain keyboard shortcuts to send the form, like enter, it will still trigger the event in Wized and not just submit the form and nothing happens. So this is why we're going to apply the Wized attribute on the form, so that whenever, no matter how, submit button, enter key, whatever, no matter how the form gets submitted, we are going to be able to listen for the submit event. Very important. So let's go to the custom attribute section in the setting panel in your Webflow build, and we're going to type in Wized. You can also do WEL, but I was being told I have to say Wized. So we're going to type in Wized, because WEL was the old version, and one of the issues of using WEL is we don't know how long it will still be maintained. That was something from version 1 that they inherited in version 2. So if you look at old tutorials and you see people typing WEL, I would recommend you just type Wized, because we don't know how long WEL will still be maintained, because it is something from the old version of Wized. So better safe than sorry. Let's add Wized in here, so should that ever change, our site still works. So let's add Wized, and this is the new version of naming those things, just so that you don't get confused by watching at the old videos. But we're going to add Wized, and now we can name this whatever we want. So let's call this form, right? You cannot do spaces. If you want to do a space, you can do an underscore or a minus. Or you can do camel case, where I do form item, and every second word, so like every word after the first one starts with a capital first letter. So form item block, for example, right? You get the idea. So let's actually do form item. Perfect. So we have the form, and now inside of that form, we could now use Wized's feature to get the form inputs, but that is a rather limited feature because it doesn't give us real-time information. Let me tell you what is going on here. So if I'm typing in, let's do Wized dev, and I'm going to add my email, just like that. And now only if I click submit, this data is going to go to my data store. Most of the times, if you're going to build a web application, you want real-time access to whatever you type in here, right? So what we're going to utilize is, now we're not just utilizing the form attribute, adding, you know, a Wized attribute, a Wized identifier on the form, we're also utilizing the input attributes. So very simple, I'm just going to go to the input field. This is, for example, the name, and I'm going to simply go on attributes plus, let's add again Wized, and let's, oh, I can't scroll down. Okay, so then Wized, and let's add name input in camel case. Look at that. And then we want to do the same thing for the email. Let's do Wized input email input, publish, and now we're going to publish that, and then we will be able to access this data now live in our input fields. You see, we have now new data available to us. We have these input fields all of a sudden pop up. They weren't there before, and now when I type in Wized, we see in real time we are able to access the form data, and not just on submission. So again, let's put the email in here, wizeddev.com, and now as you can see, that data is immediately accessible to me. Now in the form data, when I click on submit, it is only accessible after submit. But again, we are still submitting a form, and my email is now full of Webflow emails saying me, hey, you got a form submission. So we need to add a Wized action on here to prevent that and to send the data somewhere else. So let's go to the action panel. Oh, that was a request. Let's go to the action panel this time, and let's get to the plus icon, and let's add a new action. Let's call this form submit. Wonderful. And now let's go on type. This is an element action because we are applying this on the form item. And by the way, the X-ray mode is a nice feature because you could just, you know, click. Actually, you could delete that. You don't even need to do that with a plus. You can just click on the form item, and, you know, you can just set that up in there, and the attribute is already added, which is pretty neat. So let's go on event in the action section. And we're going to listen for the not click. Oh, you know, this is old school click. We're going to do submit. They changed it because now we're accessible. So we're going to go to submit. Now, if we were to submit this, we're still getting the prevent default, right? Even though we set it to action. So there is a section saying prevent default. The moment I check this, and let's just reload, and I put in Wized dev and my email, just like that, and submit it, it is still submitting that for some reason. So let's see. Form item, that is a form element. It is applied on the form element. Yes, we have the Wized attribute on here. And the button is a form button. Form element is applied. Oh, I could assume that it is doing that because it may not be fully set, because I haven't added any action in here. So let's just add an action for run function. And just don't follow this, please. I'm just doing silly stuff here to see. Okay. Yes, okay. Okay, that should do it. So if I now add information in here and click on submit, it will not submit it. So why it submitted it earlier, even though prevent default was checked? Because, you know, this lower part here wasn't configured, so Wized hasn't added that in my configuration. They thought, I'm still working on it. It was still in draft. So, we're going to clear that now because we're going to do something else. But if you check prevent default on submit, as you can see, because there's nothing in here, I have to do something, otherwise it will not work, right? I cannot just, if I want to prevent default on something without doing anything, I would have to at least return 0, because otherwise, it will still return it. If I were to remove that, it will still return it. So send it. So I need to write return anything. It can be return 1, return 0, to just block that behavior. But, we're going to add more code in here that is not too important. But just so that you know, in case that is something you're looking for. I didn't know that, so you always learn something new. And then you have the setting for reset form. If I'm going to check this, on submit, it is always going to reset the information. As you can see here, if I click on submit, it will be preventing the default now and resetting the information. Beautiful. So now what we can do is we can add an action in here to perform a request or anything. We can do set cookie, set variable, navigate to, run function. We have all the flexibilities, so we can tie any kind of other action, every kind of event, every kind of request to this form submission and get the data that was added in here there. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So let's just do request, because we need to perform a request to send the data somewhere, right? The requests are data going and coming and all of that. But let's just stop here and let's go to the requests. And let's actually go to Zano. Any backend works. And let's just set up a little database. So I'm just going to go to add table. I'm going to call this form item submissions. I will just do UUID. That is not too important, but why not? And let's add text. Let's call this name. And let's add a new item called email. We actually use the email item, and we're just going to call this email. Just like that. So we have our database set up. And now we're just, creating an endpoint to post the data. Here we go. To post the data. So we're going to go to API. We're going to create new API endpoint group. And I have like 100 endpoints or so. And let's create another endpoint group. And let's go to add endpoint. And actually, before we add any endpoints, we can already copy the base URL and add it to Wized as an application, as an app. So we're going to go to the apps panel. We're going to click on plus. And let's call this Zano form, right? Because you may have multiple groups, so it always makes sense to name those, because you can add multiple times Zano for different groups. And because Wized doesn't have a Zano integration natively, we're just going to use the REST API. Now, the REST API integration works with even webhook systems like Zapier, Make, works with Zano, can work with Supabase, Firebase, MemberStack, like everything that is on the internet using HTTP notifications, like an HTTP communication, can be connected with the REST API in Wized. So I'm just going to write return, and I'm going to put the URL in here. Now, when I'm going to create my endpoint, I will get something like / let's say, submit, right? But I don't want to add that in here. Oh, and I opened the dictionary. I don't want to add that in here, because think of it like this. Then I will have to create one app for every little endpoint branch. I will have to create an app for Zano submit. I will have to create an app for Zano read. For, I just want to keep it more general. So Wized thought for you about that. We're just only going to add the general endpoint group. And then when I add a new endpoint in here, let's do a new one. Let's call this submit, right? And this will be a post. and I have my endpoint here, and when I get this URL, as I already showed you, you know, it will have this /submit. But I'm not going to add the /submit in here because this will happen in the request. So when I have 50 endpoints in here, they all link to the same group, and then in the request we just, link the little branches so that we don't end up having like 50 apps linked to our Wized account. So here we go, this is it, and now the app has been added. So now when I go to my requests, I'm just going to go to the plus, and let's call this submit, like the submit endpoint. Let's go to app, and you see we have the Zano app in here. Let's write return, and let's put this endpoint branch in here. And now, as we can see, we defined here this is a post endpoint. So I'm going to map this to a post in Wized as well. Now, as you can see, if I were to run this endpoint, nothing is coming back, but it was successful. So we actually already, if I refresh that request history, it takes sometimes a little bit to log that, but we should be seeing that Wized tried to call our, as you can see, yes, here. So we saw Wized called us, but, sent nothing, and so on. It came from the server, from Wized, and pretty cool stuff. So we already got that. So what we want to do now is we want to configure this endpoint to add this information to our record that we have in Zano, to our table. So I'm going to go to plus, and we need to receive a name. So I'm going to add the name, and we also need to receive an email. So I'm going to go to the email and call this email. Let's publish this, and let's do this in steps so it's easier to understand how all of those elements work. So now if I'm going to run this request, and I copied this by mistake. Now if I'm going to run this request, without this information, it still works because it's not required. We can also make, say, they need to be required. So we're going to go on here and we click on required, yes. So if I'm going to publish this right now, you will be seeing that when I run this request in Wized, it will say, no, it doesn't work. This is missing. We need email and name, and you are sending us none of that. So what we want to do is, if this is a post, we're going to go with the body. If this would be a GET request, we need to do this in the URL parameters, just so that you know. But with the post, we're going to go to the body, and I'm going to add name, and I'm going to add email, right? Because our endpoint receives name and email. So in the data that Wized is sending to this endpoint, we need to send the name and the email. So let's just add some dummy data here. Let's do return. Let's do name Mark and email mark@apple.com. Beautiful. So now when I sent this data, it was successful all of a sudden again. And when I now go to my request history, and I'm going to, that was the old one. Zano is a little bit slow today. It may be the heat. So let's go to the latest request, and we see we received the name of Mark and the email of mark@apple.com. So what we want to do now is, in Wized, we want to map this to the dynamic fields that we have in Wized. And the easiest way to do that is to add some data. Let's add Wized dev and hey@wizddev.com, right? So now, let's just remove Mark. Sorry, Mark. But now, I like to do this based on the input values. I know some of them really like to base this on the forms because you don't have to add the extra attributes, but I like basing this on the input fields because they are immediately accessible to me, and I can access them. Like adding those is a no-brainer because I can access them immediately also in different things and say, your password sounds a little bit weak. Before you send this, let's just add 5 more characters and so on. So I like using inputs. I don't like the form stuff, so we're going to use the inputs here because they are, when I work with the data in here, I see the data I'm working with. with the forms, I'm not seeing that data only after I send it. But the moment I send it, the data is already gone. And it's hard to debug it with the forms, as far as I can see. So we're going to use the inputs, and I would highly recommend you to not use the form stuff only for the submissions, right? But don't use this when you do requests if it's not just a normal form submission. But, let's add the input here. So this is the name. We want to map it to the name input variable, right? This is the name. So I'm going to write return, and I'm going to add this in here. So now I can just double check this by running this, and we see, yes, that is the name that works. So now if I do the same thing for the email, let's remove the hard-coded value, and let's go to the input, to the i.email input, and now when I run this, we see that's the email. So now when I run this request in Wized, and we go back to Zano, to the request history, let's make sure it is the latest one. It takes some time. It happens instantly, but they have to do that all on their backend to show it on your account as well. So that was the thing we just did. Let's go to input, and we see WizDev and hey@wizdev.com. So that is the data we sent. So this is beautiful. We now have this set up in Wized that we are sending the data, and when we do this manual request, and we're getting it on the backend. So now we need to tie this request that we have set up, that when I'm going to type this data in here, right, and click on submit, it's not doing a form submission. So in order to do that, let's go back to our form, and we have on event, submit, perfect, prevent default and reset form, perform request, right, because we want a request to be performed of submit. So we're going to go to perform request, and we're selecting just simply our submit request. Now, if we're going to run this, let's look at this request here, and I'm going to add some dummy data. Let's do Adam at apple.com, right? We have the data immediately available to us. And now when I click on submit, look into this section here. This is where the magic will happen. When I click now on submit, this is running, and this request was now posted to our backend, tied to the action, linked on the form, right? So I have that in here on event submit, and it cleared it because we have the reset form on and prevent default, so it didn't send an email to my inbox with a generic webflow form email. You got a form submission. And that is pretty cool. And let's see if it went to our database. Let's go to request history. As you can see, Adam is in here. Beautiful. But now we're not doing anything. We're just getting the data that, Adam is there. But we need to do some things. We need to add that Adam to our database. So let's go to the database. Let's hope he didn't magically appear in there, which he shouldn't. But let's just double check. Let's go to my forms database, so form item submissions. Yeah, he isn't in there yet. So what we need to do is we need to go to the function stack and define some logic to add him into our table. The easiest way we're going to do that is to click on the plus, and we're going to go to add record. Wonderful. And then we can go to form item submissions, and we just keep everything as it is. Zano automatically mapped that because the name and the email are the same name and email values as, in the database. If those would be different, let's pretend they would be different, we would then, so little interruption, I'm back. So since we have the names in here already mapped from the names that, we have name, and then the database here says name and email, so it matched it. I'm back. Sorry for a little interruption. But as you can see, the name is now mapped to the name, and the email is now mapped to the email, because the name input and the email input are the same as the name input field in the database and the email input field. If they would be different, they would just be empty. Let's just do this together so we can, understand that as well. I would go to the name, and I would go to inputs and map name with the name, and would map email with the email that is associated with the email. I would go on save. That would be it. I'm adding the record. And now I can just simply go to run and debug, and let's do test. Email will be email@test.com. I run this. The record has been created. If I now go back to my database and, re-render the list, we see that this has been added to our database beautifully. So now we're just going to publish this endpoint, and we're going to go back to Wized and have Wized now, publish this, process this. So let's go back to our request here. We see the request is here, and let's type in Wized dev and hey at wizeddev.com. I'm going to click on submit. We see that has been added after the request has been finished. The record fields have been wiped out. And if we refresh the database, we see that this has now been posted in our table. Now, this is it, but it doesn't have to stop that way, because now from here, you can do API calls. You can do, call external APIs. You have all those exciting features that now, since the data is in Zano, you have endless possibilities what you can do with that data. You can send it to ChatGPT. You can do all of that amazing stuff. But important is getting the data from Wized to Zano, because, once the data is in Zano, everything is super easy. But, the way in between is where some of the times, there are little roadblocks, and I hope that this video helps you avoid those roadblocks, and I hope that you're going to build exciting projects using forms, because forms are basically everything. Everything is based on a form. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all your time. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'm always here to help. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.